I'm Tonia Plakhotniuk, Vice President of Northwest Climate and ESG Capital Markets team. And today we will be discussing a new plan published by the UK's government on the 30th of March to power up Britain, which is an updated strategy to help the UK ensure its energy security, deliver on the net zero commitments, and capture the economic opportunities of the net zero transition. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Simon Connell, who is a director at Baringa Partners. Simon is a senior leader in Baringa's financial services practice, supporting clients across climate and sustainability, and with a particular focus on natural capital. Simon is also a senior associate at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Simon, thank you very much for being here with us today. And I would just like to kick off with a couple of questions. And firstly, could you please outline broadly what has actually been announced by the UK government?
Of course, thank you, Tonia. So, as you said, the government has announced a series of measures. In total, this is 2,800 pages of documentation, so not an insignificant amount, which set out various components of its green strategy for the UK economy in the coming years. And we should see that against the backdrop in which we have the US Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, and the EU Green Deal and the Fit for 55 regime. And so for those in the sustainable finance community, I think we're now in a position that should be very pleased to be in, that there's a real international competitiveness to who can attract the most investment into transition and greening their economies. And so again, this is the UK government's response. I think we see it as the UK trying to maintain influence and attractiveness, including, as we'll get into, the UK's continued role as a global financial centre and as an aspiring net zero financial centre. But we should keep in mind the political context to this. And I would see that at two levels. One is the publication timelines around those 2,800 pages of documentation were not set by the UK government itself. They were set by a court ruling that said the UK government needed to publish this. So there was a little bit of force there to get that to happen. The second is, of course, we should be aware that administrations change. And even within that, we've had a single Conservative administration for some time, but a number of different leaders, all of whom had their own impact on this regime. And we're coming up to general elections before too long. So it's really around how much of this we should look for direction versus how much certainty, stability provides for us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon. And indeed, I mean, even considering the number of pages, the plan doesn't tend to cover a lot of ground. But as you've mentioned, the UK is definitely not alone in its aspiration to deliver on its net zero objectives. And you have mentioned the initiatives by the US and the European Union. What are your views on, I would say, on the comparability in terms of the scale and potential effectiveness of the UK, of the UK's plan versus the US and the European Union, considering the political context and some of the nuances that you have just outlined?
So we see all three economies with significant capital needs for the transition. The UK's green finance strategy lays out what it sees as somewhere between 50 and 60 billion pounds sterling in capital investment each year in the coming decades. So there's significant need there. But it's hard not, if looking at something like the UK strategy alongside the US IRA and the EU Green Deal, to see a reflection of the macroeconomics in each of those regions. So of course, the US having had a relatively strong response economically as they've returned out of that COVID period, and therefore the ability to have and to manage some of the inflationary impacts of the US IRA and the significant tax credits and other incentives that it's providing, which are giving the US globally leading capabilities in areas like battery manufacturing. You're seeing a lot of investment shifting there. The EU, again, trying to stay competitive in that context, has a long-standing plan here. I think it's fair to say they've been thinking about this perhaps longer than the US, but the US has moved faster. And as I say, I think for me, it's about the UK trying to maintain some long-standing ambitions, doing so perhaps in a fiscally constrained backdrop, and therefore trying to be really smart about how they do this. There's relatively little new money coming out of the announcements that we saw in the plan, and also doing so in a way that continues to give them international relevance. Again, in that backdrop, and it's one of the things that's quite interesting to me about in particular, the green finance strategy, is we see a lot more in that document about the UK's role in a global setting than perhaps we did do in its predecessor document that was released in 2019.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And speaking of the green finance strategy, actually, could you tell us a bit more? What is it trying to achieve, and how does it compare with the 2019 strategy? It has been only a few years ago. So what are the major updates, you would say?
Of course, and perhaps consistent with the volume of documentation, the first thing to note is it has increased. So this is still 132 pages of documents in that green finance strategy, up from 43 last time. So triple the length. And again, that to me reflects the continued growth and the maturing of the global sustainable finance market and the need for policymakers and regulators to respond accordingly. The UK was a leader in creating that initial strategy in 2019 and really anchoring it around these dual concepts of greening finance and financing green. And that market has shifted and become more complex as we've seen regulators and supervisors across the globe pick up that baton. And so to me, I think there's a couple of things that really stand out. So perhaps the first place for us to start as we look at the announcements is around transition plans. And again, if we take ourselves back in time, we have the concept of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as this regime that was designed by the private sector for the private sector to provide the flow of information necessary to make informed decisions on capital allocation around climate. And that has worked to an extent, and we've seen that be embraced by the official sector, including in the UK, where we've got a comply or explain TCFD-aligned reporting regime for larger organisations. But there's still some debate about the effectiveness of that. And if we think that, in many ways, if we take ourselves back to some of the original intention of TCFD, it was really, show me in your financial statements how climate is going to impact your organisation. And I don't think we've ever quite got there. We have a proliferation of metrics in use across corporates and financial institutions to think about their climate impact and think about their climate risk. But it's very hard to distill that into pounds, shilling, and pence. And so what the TPT is trying to do here is say, okay, information's flowing, that's a positive, but if it's not decision useful, how do we really sharpen that? And so the TPT was announced by the UK government as one of its flagship policies at COP26, again, seeking to influence the international environment, and then it's being embraced in this green finance strategy. And really the heart of that is setting out the financial implications of climate change on an organisation, the assumptions and dependencies around that. So really trying to get into the heart of audited financial statements. And then we see the green and finance strategy talk about trying to close the gap and create parity between public and private companies. So it's still framed in there as a comply or explain regime, and we've seen some stakeholders already pushing back and saying that doesn't go far enough, you have to mandate this, but it's trying to enhance the quality of decision making and decision useful financial information. And tied to that, we've got some expectations around there on things like Scope 3 reporting. So I think that's the first piece. We have economies in transition, we have companies in transition, but the green finance strategy is saying, show us more, give us more information to make sure we can, again, put capital towards those who are differentiated in their transition. At the same time, I think there's a piece there in the strategy around adaptation and resilience. So for a long time, we felt that perhaps the finance community has struggled to find a voice on the concept of climate adaptation. So how do you actually make sure that we can cope with the effects of climate change? And some of that is because it's been hard to focus attention there without acknowledging that there is going to be climate change, and therefore to disrupt the narrative about the importance of climate mitigation and actually stopping some of that climate change happening. And the green finance strategy steps into this space and says, well, the world is warming. We still want to get to net zero, but it's really important that we get more information about that. So again, what we're seeing here, and this is true across much of the strategy, but there's a focus on an action plan, a finance plan, adaptation metrics, but we're not being given them now. They're not in those 132 pages. There's something to come. And this, I think, links back to the comments I made before. So this is really setting a direction that we might expect to see continued, irrespective of future administration priorities, but giving it that space that says, yeah, let's keep transitioning to net zero, but how are we coping with the climate effects that we're already experiencing? Another piece there that's close to my heart is nature and biodiversity. And again, if we saw the UK taking a leadership stance on things like wanting to be a net zero financial centre, or in its publication of a green finance strategy, this is an area that UK has been leading for some time. So it has commissioned things like the Dasgupta report on the economics of biodiversity to try and show people that this really isn't being factored into decision making. It's been a key driver behind things like the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, so the cousin, if you will, to the TCFD, but trying to, again, provoke this flow of information from corporates to financial institutions to try and inform decision making. And so the green finance strategy echoes that and builds on that. And we see things like the announcement slightly to one side, but within this architecture of a nature markets framework. And that's quite innovative. So the UK is really trying to say, how do we get capital flowing here? And even some of the integration into the real economy here, things like the biodiversity net gain regime that is coming in, and the way in which there's expected to be an interplay between the agricultural community and the developer and the construction community. You know, we're seeing estimates that could be a $200 million a year market and flow of capital there. And so here we're seeing the government acknowledging the role of nature within the Transition Plan Task Force, continuing to support the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, and really quite importantly, particularly for financial institutions, acknowledging that they're going to do some work on sizing the impact of nature to the UK economy. And for me, this is fascinating because if we think back to the CBES, the climate scenario analysis exercise that the Bank of England ran a few years ago, it was a very labour-intensive, very bottom-up exercise. And we've seen some response to that from the financial sector, but there was a sense of proportionality and a question of whether the effort that went into it, did we come up with the answer that we wanted? And it feels to me like actually sizing the impact to the economy and then giving that to the finance sector and saying, okay, how does this present risks to you is an elegant way of looking at things the other way around. The next element I want to turn to is really just about usability. And here we do come back into the UK operating as a global financial centre, that global net zero financial centre, and therefore sitting within international architecture. And if we look across the channel, we can see that there's been the European Grand Project around their sustainable finance architecture, but it too has experienced some delays and some politically contentious components. And so we're starting to see, even in things like the speed of fund launches in Europe, that the market is responding with some degree of hesitation, saying, actually, this is quite hard for us to digest, so we might just take a little bit of a pause. And so I think the UK is trying to take quite a thoughtful stance in its green finance strategy in response. I mean, we've already seen about an 18-month delay in the release of a UK taxonomy. And again, we can debate the reasons for that, but some of it does feel to be look, let's watch what's happening with taxonomy internationally. Let's be thoughtful about that and try to avoid some of those design elements. But there is also the desire here for the UK to be very industry-led. And so the strategy confirmed that there is going to be an industry-led market review of transition finance approaches. So how do we get as much capital as possible, not just flowing to the activities that are often categorized under a taxonomy, so pure play green activities, but how do we make sure that we support the capital flows to organizations who are decarbonizing their operations, but not necessarily fully eligible? And so I think there's a degree of pragmatism that's being brought here. But we may still see those tensions come back out. So we may well find that as the taxonomy comes through, we see that indicating areas where perhaps there isn't as much in the way of an industrial strategy in the UK. And this is one of the areas of critique that we're hearing around both the green finance strategy and the wider set of announcements on Powering Up Britain plan is, does it really represent a plan? Is it coherent? And so we're seeing some areas that are missing, and they may well say, as we start to get taxonomy, which defines green activities for the finance sector, we may well start to see those tensions come out again. And I think it's worth just bearing in mind that there are still going to be interoperability challenges between any UK regime and a European regime here. I think the last stats I saw were that around 80% of funds on the UK market are also available in the European markets. And so how do we navigate between those two regimes? And that perhaps brings us on to the last area that I think is worth exploring in the green finance strategy. And that's really balancing the needs of corporates versus consumers. And so the UK regulators face a not insignificant challenge here. There is a key line to me in the strategy that acknowledges that stakeholder feedback is calling for both innovative financial products and a high integrity approach to transition financing. And so this connects to some of those comments that we just made around taxonomy. But as higher emitting companies seek to reduce their emissions over time, there's a lot of judgment involved in there in terms of who gets capital. And we can see again the politicization of things like gas and nuclear playing into that. And their inclusion both in the EU but the UK taxonomy as well. We can see that delay in the UK's sustainability disclosure regime, or SDR, and just as importantly, the all-purpose greenwashing regime that was going to be wrapped around that as well for consumers. And so there are signals in the strategy here that the government recognises the need to balance those two. But I think as we go forward, as we see how the implementation takes place here, we're going to see some real tensions there between trying to have a market that enables capital flow at scale for corporates, and yet at the same time recognizing that many of those exposures then make their way into retail instruments, and that retail consumers need protection at the same time. And perhaps one thing that demonstrates the sensitivity there is the confirmation in the strategy that there's an intention to both set up some industry self-regulation, so a code of conduct around data and ratings, but also a consultation on regulating ESG data providers themselves. So really trying to take that incremental approach to say, well, look, let's see if the industry can get itself into the right position, and if not, then the regulators step in. So that was just a snapshot of some of the things that are in those 132 pages. It's a dense and detailed read, and perhaps one of the things we didn't touch on in detail was that desire for the UK to demonstrate its international influence and its international relevance here, and therefore how they're talking about things like blended finance and participation more globally. And I think that's worth noting. But really, this is a story of a large number of consultations, a large number of statements of intent, relatively little new capital being deployed towards technologies, but I hope that by setting in place the right market infrastructure, that problem solves itself.
Yes, thank you, Simon. Totally agree with your assessment that the package is largely directional, and that not much of new money has been created through this package. However, indeed, I think the UK government was trying to take a pragmatic view, understanding its fiscal position as of the moment and the related constraints as to what be feasible to deliver. We definitely look forward to hearing more on the investment roadmaps, on the UK taxonomy, as well as the consultation on the voluntary carbon markets. I think it will be interesting to see how indeed some of the elements of the green strategy will work together, because ultimately transition plans, adaptation resilience, and nature biodiversity, there's such connected areas that it's becoming difficult to see them as separate elements, although I think it will be a bit of a journey to go through before these three elements will be seen as one holistic package, and where companies and financial services would be able to set their strategies and goals, I would say, taking into account nature, climate, need for adaptation and transition, all at the same time. However, we definitely need to start with something, and especially the work on transition plan, the plan framework is proving to be increasingly important, and we all look forward to seeing the final publication of the framework, as well as sectoral guidance on transition plans, which we expect to come out over the summertime. So Simon, thank you so much for your insights today. It's been a pleasure to host you. Thank you for your time. We would conclude our discussion for today. And as I said, we look forward to supporting the UK government in the delivery of its green finance strategy, as well as the net zero goals. And we invite our audience to look out for more sessions like this. And we hope everyone enjoyed the conversation. Take care.